I first arrived at my uncle's farmhouse in rural Iowa, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Evan Sutton. I am a college student, and every summer, I drive out to the Midwest to help my uncle maintain his property. He owns about 40 acres of land, mostly open fields and dense woods. He is getting older and can no longer handle the heavy physical labor required to keep a farm running. My job was straightforward. I spent my days repairing wooden fences, mowing the large pastures, maintaining the heavy machinery, and fixing whatever broke down around the house. I always enjoyed the work because it was quiet, and the money helped pay for my classes. The main focus of my maintenance that summer was the old barn. It sat about 100 yards behind the main house, entirely out of sight from the living room windows due to a row of tall pine trees. The barn was a massive, weathered wooden structure with a rusty tin roof. We used it to store large equipment, spare lumber, and a wide variety of tools. The main entrance to the barn consisted of two heavy sliding wooden doors. To secure them, there was a thick iron latch on the inside that dropped into a metal bracket and a standard heavy-duty padlock mechanism on the outside. We exclusively used the outside padlock mechanism on the outside. The only possible way to lock the inside iron latch was to be physically standing inside the barn. There was also a small side door for easy access and a few ground-level windows that were covered in dust and cobwebs. It was my second week there when things started getting strange. I woke up around 6 a.m. to get an early start on repairing a section of wire fence. I walked out to the barn to grab a set of wire cutters and a heavy hammer. The morning was completely silent, and a thick layer of fog was rolling over the damp grass. I reached the barn, took the brass key from my pocket, and unlocked the outside padlock. I pulled the heavy lock off the metal loop and grabbed the wooden door handle. I pulled to the right, expecting the door to slide open. It moved about an inch before stopping with a loud, metallic clank. I pulled harder, thinking the heavy door had just jumped off its metal track. I heard the exact same clink. That was when I realized it was the inside latch. The heavy iron bar had been dropped down into its bracket. I stood there in the damp grass, completely confused. I assumed my uncle must have gone into the barn late the previous night, locked the main doors from the inside while he was working, and then simply left through the small side door. I walked around the side of the wooden building. I turned the handle on the side door, and it opened easily. I stepped into the dark barn and walked over to the main sliding doors. Sure enough, the thick iron latch was dropped firmly into place. I lifted it up and pushed the doors open to let the morning daylight inside. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I figured my uncle was just getting forgetful. I walked over to the large wooden tool bench against the back wall. As I reached for my tools, I noticed something missing. My large pair of heavy-duty wire cutters was gone from its specific hook on the pegboard. I searched the messy bench and checked the dirt floor underneath, but they were nowhere to be found. I assumed I had left them out in the field the day before and went about my morning chores. The next morning I went back to the barn. The padlock on the main doors was secure. I unlocked it and the doors slid open easily. I stepped inside and turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. It had rained heavily during the night, and the ground outside was pure mud. As the dim lights flickered on, I looked down at the packed dirt floor of the barn. Leading from the side door, straight across the center of the room, was a clear set of muddy boot prints. The mud was fresh and still wet. The prints were large, deeply pressed into the dirt, indicating whoever made them was heavy. I followed the trail with my eyes. They did not go toward the tool bench. Instead, they went straight toward the back corner of the barn, stopping right at the base of the old wooden ladder that led up to the loft. The loft covered the entire back half of the barn. It was a massive, dark storage space that my uncle had not used in over 15 years. I stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up into the darkness. I did not want to climb it. I felt uneasy, but I needed to know what was up there. I gripped the rough wooden rungs and started climbing. There was a loud creaking noise with every step I took. When I reached the top, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and turned on the flashlight. I swept the beam across the space. It was mostly filled with rotting hay bales and broken furniture. Then, the light caught something in the far back corner, hidden behind a tall stack of hay. I walked toward it slowly. Behind the hay bales was a cleared-out space. Resting on the wooden floorboards was a dark green sleeping bag. Next to it was a pile of empty baked bean cans, several crushed plastic water bottles, and a pile of thick wool blankets. Sitting neatly next to the sleeping bag were my missing wire cutters. Someone had been living up here. They had been locking the barn door from the inside to secure the building while they slept. I was furious and creeped out at the same time. I immediately grabbed a large heavy-duty trash bag from downstairs. I marched back up to the loft and shoved the sleeping bag, the blankets, the empty cans, and the bottles into the bag. I cleared the space completely, leaving nothing but bare wooden floorboards. I dragged the heavy bag outside and threw it directly into the large industrial dumpster at the edge of the property. I told my uncle what I found. We assumed it was just a transient who had wandered off the highway and found a dry place to crash. We spent the afternoon securing the barn. We hammered thick nails into the frames of all the ground-level windows so they could not be opened. We made sure the side door was locked tightly. 2 days passed without any issues. The farm was quiet. I thought the problem was completely resolved. Then came Thursday morning. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to do some maintenance on the tractor. I walked across the yard holding a cup of coffee. The sun was not up yet, and the property was pitch black. I reached the main barn doors and reached for the padlock. It was already unlocked. The heavy metal lock was just hanging open from the latch. My stomach dropped. I knew for an absolute fact I had locked it the night before. I grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door moved an inch and stopped with a heavy metallic clink. It was locked from the inside again. I dropped my coffee cup and ran to the side door. I grabbed the handle and twisted it. The deadbolt was turned from the inside. Now I was locked out entirely. I walked around the perimeter of the barn until I found one of the ground-level windows we had nailed shut. I used a flathead screwdriver from my pocket to pry the nails loose. The old wood splintered with a loud cracking sound, and I managed to push the window open. I climbed through the window, my boots hitting the dirt floor. The barn was dead silent. I walked to the side door. It was locked from the inside. Someone was definitely in here. I checked the tool bench. My heavy framing hammer was missing. I went straight to the old wooden ladder. I climbed up the rungs as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I turned on my flashlight and shined it directly at the back corner where the sleeping area used to be. The sleeping bag and the blankets were still gone. I had thrown them all away. The corner was empty. With sitting perfectly in the center of the bare wooden floorboards was a small, black, spiral-bound notebook. I walked over and picked it up. The cover was worn and dirty. I flipped it open. The pages were completely filled with cramped handwriting. I shined my light on the paper and started reading. It was a detailed log of my daily routine. It listed the exact time I woke up each day. It described the specific clothes I was wearing. It noted the times my uncle and I sat down for dinner. There were detailed maps drawn of the blind spots on the property, highlighting the areas where the barn could not be seen from the house. My hands started shaking as I flipped to the very last page. There was a single entry written in dark black ink. It was dated from yesterday afternoon. It detailed the exact time I had thrown the trash bag into the dumpster. The last entry had been written the day before, even though I had already removed everything from the loft. They had come back to an empty loft, sat on the bare floor, and watched me throw their belongings away. I shoved the notebook into my pocket, climbed down the ladder, and sprinted back to the house. I locked the doors and immediately called the police. 2 officers arrived shortly after. They drew their weapons and searched the entire barn, including the loft. They found no one. They took the notebook as evidence, told us to keep the doors locked, and promised to increase patrols in the area. They said the person was likely long gone by now. That night, neither my uncle nor I slept. We kept every exterior light turned on. I sat in the living room listening to the house settle, waiting to hear the sound of footsteps outside. But nothing happened. The next morning, the sun came up, and the property felt a little less isolated. I decided to go out to the barn to replace the old padlock with a heavy-duty combination lock. I walked across the damp grass and stood in front of the heavy sliding doors. I grabbed the wooden handle and gave it a tug, just to make sure the track was clear before I installed the new lock. The door moved an inch and stopped with a dull metallic clank. I stood completely frozen. I didn't try the side door. I didn't try to pry open a window. I just walked around to the side of the barn, looking at the row of ground-level windows. The glass on the third window was completely shattered. Large, jagged pieces were scattered across the dirt on the outside, meaning it had been broken from the inside. I stood a few feet back and looked through the hole in the broken frame. I looked past the messy tool bench, straight toward the back corner of the dirt floor. Sitting perfectly centered on the bottom rung of the wooden ladder was my missing framing hammer. Tucked neatly underneath the heavy metal head was a single piece of lined paper ripped from a spiral notebook. What would you do if you found out someone was living inside your property without you knowing? I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at the abandoned farmhouse in Oklahoma, but it did. My name is Logan Pierce. A few years ago, I inherited a large property from my grandparents. It was located in a very rural part of the state, surrounded by nothing but flat, dry fields and miles of overgrown dirt roads. The closest town was a 40-minute drive away, and my nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles down the highway. The house itself was a massive, 2-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch that was slowly rotting away. It had been sitting completely vacant for over 6 years before I finally decided to travel out there, fix it up, and eventually put it on the market. I planned to do most of the renovation work myself to save money. I packed my truck with tools, supplies, and a small mattress, and moved into the house. Because the property had been neglected for so long, I decided to tackle the project one section at a time. I set up my temporary living space in the downstairs master bedroom. It was the only room on the first floor that had intact windows and a working electrical outlet for a small space heater. The second floor of the house was a different story. It consisted of a long, narrow hallway with 3 separate bedrooms. 2 of those rooms were completely empty, containing nothing but exposed wooden floorboards, peeling yellow wallpaper, and thick layers of dust. The third room, located at the very end of the hallway, was the only one that still had furniture. My grandparents had left a few heavy, antique pieces up there that were simply too difficult to move. There was a massive wooden dresser against the left wall, a heavy oak bed frame without a mattress in the center, and a faded floral armchair sitting perfectly angled toward the only window in the room. I hadn't started any renovations on the second floor yet, so I essentially ignored it. I kept the heavy wooden door to that bedroom pulled tightly shut so the stale, dusty air wouldn't circulate downstairs while I worked. It was a Tuesday evening when I first went up there to take some basic measurements. I needed to know the dimensions of the window frames so I could order replacement glass. I walked up the steep wooden stairs, the old steps creaking under my heavy work boots, and headed down the dark hallway. I grabbed the brass doorknob, turned it, and pushed the door open. The air inside the room was heavy and smelled like old wood and mildew. I walked over to the window with my metal tape measure. As I approached the glass, I noticed something that immediately made me pause. The heavy floral curtains, which had been drawn completely shut when I first inspected the house weeks ago, were now pulled wide open. They were gathered neatly and tied behind the metal brass hooks mounted on the wall. I stood there staring at them. I felt uneasy for a second. I distinctly remembered keeping them closed to prevent the harsh afternoon sun from further fading the antique furniture. As I turned around to look at the rest of the room, I noticed something else. The top right drawer of the massive wooden dresser was pulled out about 3 inches. I stood in the center of the dusty room, trying to make sense of it. I eventually rationalized that I must have opened the drawer to look inside during my initial walkthrough, and simply forgot to push it completely shut. As for the curtains, I convinced myself that the old fabric must have just slipped off the hooks or blown open from a strong draft. I took my window measurements, walked over to the dresser, and pushed the drawer perfectly flush. I untied the curtains, pulled them tightly shut across the glass, and went back downstairs to continue my work. On Thursday afternoon, the weather turned cold and gray. I was working outside, clearing away thick, overgrown brush near the front porch. I needed a specific flathead screwdriver that I realized I had left sitting on the windowsill in that upstairs bedroom. I wiped the dirt off my hands, walked inside, and headed straight up the wooden staircase. I walked down the hallway and pushed the bedroom door open. I immediately stopped in the doorway. The floral curtains were pulled wide open again, tied neatly behind the metal hooks. The faded armchair, which had always faced the center of the room, was now rotated. It was angled completely toward the open window, looking out over the front yard. My stomach dropped. I walked into the room slowly. I looked over at the heavy wooden dresser. The top right drawer was pulled open again, but this time, the bottom drawer was also pulled out entirely. I walked over and looked inside the open drawers. They were completely empty, containing nothing but bare wood and dust. But there was absolutely no way to deny it anymore. I knew for an absolute fact I had closed everything and shut those curtains 2 days ago. The house was supposed to be completely empty. The nearest person was miles away. I checked the other 2 bare bedrooms, but nothing was disturbed. I went back downstairs and systematically checked every single exterior door and window. Everything was securely locked from the inside. There were no broken panes of glass, no pry marks on the door frames, and no signs of forced entry anywhere. I spent the rest of that evening sitting on my mattress in the downstairs bedroom with a heavy metal flashlight resting on my lap. I listened to every slight shift and groan the old house made as the wind blew outside. I barely slept, waiting to hear the sound of footsteps on the floorboards above me. But the night remained completely quiet. By Saturday morning, I had enough. I woke up at 6 a.m. with a clear plan. I was going to drag all the antique furniture out of that upstairs room, lock the door entirely, and install a heavy deadbolt on the outside of it. I walked up the stairs holding a pair of thick leather work gloves. The morning house was silent. I reached the end of the hall, grabbed the brass knob, and pushed the door open. The room had changed again. The armchair was pushed completely flush against the far wall, but what immediately caught my attention was the wooden dresser. All 4 drawers were pulled completely open at different lengths, making it look like a chaotic wooden staircase. I walked over to the dresser, my heart beating heavily in my chest. I looked down into the top right drawer. It was no longer empty. Sitting inside the dusty wood were 3 crumpled granola bar wrappers, an empty plastic water bottle, and a dark blue fleece beanie. I reached out and touched the plastic bottle. There was still a small amount of condensation near the cap. The wrappers looked completely fresh. Someone had been inside this room. They were spending time in here while I was downstairs, and they were hiding their trash in the furniture. I backed away from the dresser. As I took a step backward, the heavy heel of my work boot stepped onto a loose wooden floorboard near the edge of the bed frame. It made a sharp, hollow sound, shifting noticeably under my weight. I looked down. The old wooden board was not nailed down securely like the rest of the floor. There was a wide, visible gap running along the edge. I knelt down on the dusty floor, wedged my fingers into the gap, and pulled upward. The heavy wooden board lifted away easily, revealing a dark, hollow space tucked directly between the heavy floor joists. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. I angled the bright beam down into the narrow gap. Sitting neatly in the dust between the wooden beams was a thick stack of glossy photographs. I reached down and pulled the stack out. My hands were visibly shaking. I sat back on my heels, flipped the stack over, and looked at the very top picture. It was a photograph of me. I was standing in the front yard, holding a paint roller, working on the side of the porch. I looked at the angle of the picture. It was taken from a distance, looking past a row of old oak trees near the edge of the property line. I slid the top photo to the back and looked at the next one. It was a picture of me walking toward my truck, carrying a heavy box of tools. This one was taken from the side of the house, partially obscured by the overgrown bushes I had been clearing. I kept flipping through them rapidly. There were over 24 pictures. They carefully documented my daily routine over the last week. They showed the exact clothing I wore, the times I sat on the porch to eat my lunch, and the moments I drove away to go into town for supplies. Then, I reached the last 3 photographs at the very bottom of the stack. The setting of the pictures completely changed. It was no longer daylight. They were taken at night, illuminated only by a dim, yellowish light source. I looked closely at the first one. It showed a window. Inside the window, I could clearly see myself lying on my downstairs mattress, reading a book. I looked at the second one. It was a much closer shot of the same downstairs window. I was asleep on the mattress, facing away from the glass. The third photograph was taken from an angle that made my breath catch in my throat. The camera flash had not been used. but the ambient light showed the unmistakable white wooden frame of my bedroom window. The picture was taken from just inches outside the glass. It showed me sleeping in my bed, completely unaware, but in the bottom right corner of the photograph, resting slightly on the exterior wooden windowsill, was the dark blue fleece beanie. The person taking these pictures hadn't just been watching me from the tree line during the day. They had been standing directly outside my bedroom window while I slept, leaning against the glass. I dropped the photographs onto the dusty floor. I didn't bother grabbing the old furniture. I didn't close the dresser drawers. I turned around and sprinted out of the room. I ran down the narrow hallway and took the wooden stairs 2 at a time, my boots slamming heavily against the wood. I reached the first floor, grabbed my truck keys off the kitchen counter, and bolted out the front door into the morning air. I practically jumped into the driver's seat of my truck and locked the doors. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. As I threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the dirt driveway, I looked up at the second story of the farmhouse. The floral curtains in the bedroom at the end of the hall were pulled wide open, and standing perfectly still in the center of the window, looking down at my truck, was a tall figure wearing a dark blue beanie. How long do you think you could live in a house before realizing you weren't actually alone? It was around late summer on our family farm in rural Montana when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Robert Whitmore. My wife and I own 120 acres of land, mostly dedicated to growing feed corn. We live in a 2-story farmhouse at the end of a long, unpaved dirt road. Our closest neighbor is over 3 miles down the highway. It is usually a very peaceful way to live, but that deep isolation also means we are entirely on our own if anything happens. Late that August, there was a string of equipment thefts happening across our county. People were driving out to remote agricultural properties in the middle of the night, breaking into unlocked sheds and loading up expensive tools and small generators. They would be gone long before the sun came up. We have a large open pole barn full of valuable farming equipment, so I decided it was time to invest in a real security system. I drove into town and bought a high-quality, hardwired camera system. I didn't want to rely on wireless signals out in the country. I spent an entire Saturday running the heavy black cables through the attic, out the siding of the house, and across the property. I mounted 4 heavy-duty outdoor cameras. Camera 1 pointed down the front driveway. Camera 2 covered the inside of the equipment barn. Camera 3 aimed at the back porch. Camera 4 was the most remote. I mounted it on a tall wooden utility pole about 50 yards behind the house, right where the edge of our short grass met the dense, tall rows of the cornfield. I pointed it straight out away from the house, angled down to watch the narrow dirt access road that cut through the crops. The thick black cable ran from the camera, down the wooden pole, and all the way back across the yard into my home office. All 4 video feeds routed to a large flat-screen monitor sitting on my desk. A few days after I finished the installation, I woke up around 6 a.m. I poured a cup of coffee in the kitchen and walked into the office to check the camera feeds. The screen was split into 4 equal squares. The first 3 looked perfectly normal, but when I looked at the feed for camera 4, something felt off. Instead of showing a straight, centered view down the dirt access road, the frame was shifted slightly to the right. It was now showing a large section of the tall corn stalks and the very edge of our backyard. I assumed the mounting bracket was just loose. Montana gets heavy winds coming off the plains at night, and large birds often land on the utility poles. I walked out the back door, crossed the wet grass, and reached up to the camera. I twisted the plastic housing back to the left, centering it perfectly on the access road. I tightened the plastic wing nut at the base of the mount with my fingers as hard as I could. I went back inside and started my day. 2 days later, it happened again. I walked into the office early in the morning and looked at the monitor. My stomach dropped slightly. Camera 4 was turned again. With this time, it was not just a small shift from the wind. The camera had been rotated almost 45 degrees to the right. The dirt access road was completely out of frame. Instead, the camera was pointing directly at the side of my house. The feed clearly showed our large living room windows and the side door of our garage. I felt uneasy. There had been no strong winds the night before, and the weather had been completely clear. I walked out to the wooden pole and inspected the camera. There were no scratches or marks on the plastic casing to suggest anything had hit it. I pushed against the side of the camera with my palm. It barely moved. The wing nut was still tight. If something had moved it, it took genuine physical effort. I walked back to the garage, grabbed a heavy pair of metal pliers from my toolbox, and returned to the pole. I adjusted the camera so it perfectly faced the dirt road again, exactly how I originally installed it. Then, I clamped the metal pliers onto the plastic wing nut and turned it until it was completely locked into place. I twisted it so hard that the plastic slightly bent. I grabbed the camera with both hands and tried to shake it. It would not budge an inch. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun was even up. I walked straight into the dark office and looked at the glowing monitor. Camera 4 was turned again. It was rotated even further toward the house than the day before. It was now angled slightly upward, pointing straight at the second floor of the siding. It was aimed directly at our master bedroom window. I sat down in the desk chair and grabbed the computer mouse. I needed to know what was happening outside my house. I opened the playback software and selected the recorded footage from camera 4. I started the timeline at midnight and hit the fast forward button. I watched the digital time code in the corner of the screen tick by rapidly. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. The grainy night vision footage of the dirt road remained completely still. Then, at exactly 3:42 a.m., the image jerked violently. I immediately stopped the fast forward function and rewound the video by 2 minutes. I pressed play at normal speed and leaned closer to the monitor. The dirt road was completely empty. The corn stalks were not moving. Then, from the bottom right corner of the frame, a dark, heavy winter glove reached up into the shot. The fingers wrapped tightly around the plastic lens hood. The camera shook violently, and then the view slowly dragged to the right, stopping perfectly on my bedroom window. The glove quickly pulled back down out of frame. The person doing this was standing right against the back of the wooden pole, just out of the camera's line of sight, reaching up from below. They had forcefully overpowered the tightened mount to aim the lens at my house. I quickly loaded the footage from the very first night the camera had been moved. I skipped ahead to 3 a.m. and watched the screen. At 3:15 a.m., the same dark glove reached up and bumped the camera slightly. But this time, I noticed something else. Down in the very bottom corner of the screen, just for a fraction of a second before the camera moved, the night vision caught the edge of a dark jacket standing in the tall cornrows directly behind the pole. They had been standing out there for nights, slowly adjusting the angle, testing how far they could turn it before I noticed. I paused the video. The sun was fully up now, casting bright light across the yard. I told my wife to stay inside the house and keep all the doors locked. I put on my heavy canvas jacket and my work boots and walked out the back door. The morning air was cold and completely still. I walked across the yard, keeping my eyes fixed on the tall, dense wall of corn right behind the wooden utility pole. I reached the base of the pole. I looked up at the camera, then looked down at the dirt. There were no footprints on the grass side of the yard. Whoever was doing this was coming and going entirely through the fields. I stepped past the wooden pole and pushed my way directly into the thick, dry corn stalks. I heard the dry leaves brushing against my jacket as I moved forward. I walked about 20 feet deep into the field, moving in a straight line away from the house. The stalks were well over 8 feet tall, completely blocking my view of the house, the road, and the sky. It was just a tight wall of green and yellow in every direction. The ground was uneven, and I stepped carefully over the exposed roots. After another 10 feet, the row suddenly opened up. I stopped walking. Someone had intentionally stomped down a large circular area of corn, creating a hidden clearing that was completely invisible from the outside. Sitting in the center of the flattened stalks was a cheap, foldable canvas camping chair. Next to it was a large plastic thermos and a few empty food wrappers scattered in the loose dirt. But that was not what caught my attention. Resting on top of an overturned plastic bucket, directly facing the canvas chair, was a small, rectangular electronic device. It had a thick black casing and a short antenna sticking out of the top. A heavy wire ran from the side of the device, snaking across the dirt and disappearing toward the base of the utility pole where my camera was mounted. I slowly walked over to the bucket. The screen of the device was glowing faintly in the shadows of the tall corn. I looked down at the display. It was a portable, battery-powered video monitor, and on the screen was a perfectly clear, live video feed of my own house. The angle was pointing straight at the master bedroom window. They had physically spliced a receiver directly into my exterior wire. They were not just turning the camera to look at the house later. They were sitting out here in the dark, watching a live broadcast of us sleeping. I reached down and picked up the small monitor to disconnect the wire. As my bare hand gripped the thick plastic casing on the back of the screen, I realized something that made me stop entirely. The plastic was still warm. What would you do if you found out your own security cameras were being used to watch you?